Howdy partners, get ready to rethink your romanticized view of the Wild West as we dive into the disgusting habits and harsh realities of life on the frontier. From non-existent bathing routines to DIY tattoos gone wrong, life in the Wild West was a dirty, stinky, and often deadly affair. Let's start with the basics. Bathing. In the Wild West, bathing was a luxury few could afford. Water was precious, hauled for miles, mainly for drinking and cooking. Bathing was a rare monthly affair. Imagine a quick dip in a frigid river or a rough scrub with lye soap. Their unwashed bodies and clothes bred nasty bacteria. Speaking of breeding grounds, let's move on to the culinary delights of the Wild West. Settlers and cowboys had to contend with everything from spoiled food and dirty water to rats in the rafters. Meat was often heavily salted, smoked, or dried to prevent spoilage, resulting in a chewy, salty, and often rancid dining experience. Water sources were often contaminated with animal waste, bacteria, and parasites, making dysentery and other waterborne illnesses a constant threat. Now you might think that a stiff drink at the local saloon would offer some respite from the harsh realities of frontier life, but even a trip to the saloon wasn't safe, with bartenders serving up drinks that might contain anything from tobacco juice to kerosene. These adulterants not only tasted terrible, but could also have serious health consequences, causing everything from headaches and nausea to blindness and even death. Chapter 4. Brace yourself for frontier dentistry. If you thought the food and drinks were bad, wait till you hear about dental care in the Wild West. Toothbrushes made from coarse boar bristles and toothpaste that was just ashes and salt. These stiff bristles often did more harm than good. Forget about minty freshness or fluoride. People relied on homemade concoctions. Imagine brushing with a tool like a wire brush. DIY tattoos, the Wild West edition. Forget about fancy tattoo parlors and single-use needles. DIY tattoos were the name of the game. Infection was a constant risk, with unsterilized needles spreading everything from tetanus to syphilis. And even if you were lucky enough to avoid a life-threatening infection, you were still likely to end up with a tattoo that was poorly executed, faded, or infected. We've talked about the lack of hygiene and the questionable food and drink, but no discussion of the Wild West is complete without mentioning the pests. Rats thrived in unsanitary conditions, spreading disease and making life miserable for the inhabitants. They carried fleas that spread plague and contaminated food and water sources. Their presence alone sent shivers down the spine of even the toughest cowboy. Let's talk about a topic that's not often discussed in polite company chamber pots. In the Wild West, indoor plumbing was a luxury reserved for the wealthy, leaving most people with the unpleasant task of dealing with their bodily waste in a less than sanitary manner. Imagine the stench of stale urine and feces permeating homes, businesses, and even the streets. We've already touched on the horrors of adulterated whiskey, but the use of tobacco juice in drinks deserves its own special mention. Chewing tobacco was incredibly popular in the Wild West, with men and even some women partaking in this habit. Imagine taking a swig of your drink only to encounter a slimy glob of tobacco juice or, worse yet, the remnants of someone else's chew. As if tobacco juice wasn't bad enough, kerosene, a flammable liquid typically used for lighting and heating, also found its way into drinks in the Wild West. Bartenders, looking to stretch their liquor supplies and give their drinks an extra kick, would add kerosene to whiskey and other spirits. Drinking kerosene-laced alcohol could cause a range of symptoms, from dizziness and nausea to seizures, coma, and even death. Boar bristle. Toothbrushes, brushing, or torturing. We've already established that dental hygiene wasn't exactly a top priority in the Wild West, but the tools of the trade, or lack thereof, deserve a closer look. These brushes, fashioned from the stiff, coarse hairs of wild boars, were about as far removed from a modern toothbrush as you can get. Not only were these bristles incredibly abrasive, but they also harbored bacteria and were nearly impossible to clean properly. Ashes and salt toothpaste, a recipe for disaster. Forget about minty freshness or fluoride protection. People in the Wild West relied on homemade mixtures to clean their teeth, with ashes and salt being common ingredients. These abrasive mixtures might have offered a superficial cleaning, but they also wore down tooth enamel, making teeth more susceptible to decay and sensitivity. Filthy conditions the norm, not the exception. The lack of proper sanitation and hygiene created an environment where dirt, grime, and waste were not just common sights, but an accepted part of life. The stench alone was enough to make your eyes water, but the real danger lay in the invisible threats lurking within the filth. In the Wild West, falling ill or getting injured was a serious matter, often with life-altering or even fatal consequences. Doctors, often untrained and ill-equipped, relied on methods like bloodletting, purging, and the application of dubious concoctions to treat everything from a common cold to a gunshot wound. These treatments, often more harmful than helpful, reflected the limited understanding of disease and the human body. The lack of basic sanitation in the Wild West had far-reaching consequences. From rare bathing to improper waste disposal, life was impacted by this disregard for cleanliness. This widespread lack of hygiene created a perfect storm for disease spread. Preserving food in the Wild West was a constant battle against spoilage, with limited options for refrigeration or proper storage. Salting, smoking, and drying were common techniques, but these methods didn't always prevent the growth of bacteria that could cause food poisoning. Imagine biting into a piece of jerky, only to discover it was riddled with maggots or had a distinctly rancid taste. Contaminated water sources, a recipe for disaster. Rivers, streams, and wells, the primary sources of water, were frequently contaminated with animal waste, sewage, and other pollutants. This contamination made waterborne illnesses like cholera, typhoid fever, and dysentery rampant, claiming countless lives and adding to the misery of life on the frontier. Infestation of pests, unwelcome guests. The Wild West was a haven for pests, from the ubiquitous flies and mosquitoes to the dreaded rats and lice. Flies, drawn to garbage and animal waste, spread diseases like typhoid fever and dysentery. Primitive waste disposal, a smelly problem. In the absence of modern sewage systems, waste disposal in the Wild West was a smelly and unsanitary affair. This lack of proper waste disposal contributed to the spread of diseases like cholera and typhoid fever, making even a simple walk down the street a risky proposition. Hazardous saloon environments. Drink at your own risk. Saloons, often romanticized as hubs of social life in the Wild West, were actually breeding grounds for germs and disease. Glasses were reused without being washed, and the close proximity of patrons, many of whom were likely carrying diseases, made the saloon a risky place to be. Inadequate dental hygiene, a mouthful of trouble. The lack of knowledge about oral health, combined with a diet high in sugar and refined carbohydrates, led to widespread dental problems. Imagine the pain of a toothache with no access to painkillers or a dentist, a reality for many in the Wild West. Unhygienic personal care, a recipe for disaster. From head to toe, personal hygiene in the Wild West left much to be desired. Lice and fleas were common, spreading from person to person through close contact and shared bedding. That's all, folks, so there you have it, 21 disgusting facts about the Wild West. From filthy conditions to questionable medical practices, life was tough on the frontier. Thanks for joining us on this wild journey. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends.